Again, welcome. If you were here last week, we celebrated Redeemer 10. We looked back on the past 10 years of God's faithfulness. We're excited about what God's going to do the next 10 years. And one of the things that I mentioned was, in light of that, we want to press deeper into discipleship. As a church, to go deeper in terms of understanding our relationship with God. And one of the ways that happens is going deeper into God's Word. So for our current series, we've been looking at the book of Daniel, this theme of living in exile. The Christian life is exilic. We're exiles not in our final home, and there's a feeling of feeling displaced, of pressure to conform. How do you navigate through that? What does it look like? And the book of Daniel shows us what living in exile looks like. So today we come to perhaps the most famous chapter of all in the book of Daniel, and it's the lion's den. We're going to be reading about Daniel, who's thrown into the lion's den because he refuses to compromise his faith. And God shields him and protects him. It's an incredible, powerful story of God's deliverance. Recently, I've been trying out intermittent fasting. So I eat just from a window of from 12 to 8 p.m. for health and dietary reasons. And so that window, and then fast the other times through. And I share that because when Daniel is thrown into the lion's den, God apparently made the lions go through intermittent fasting that night. They didn't eat. And so God shields and protects Daniel in this powerful supernatural way. I want to share with you a couple of paintings just to reflect on. Some of you are visual, and as you listen and learn, just think about the imagination of God's word and what did it mean? What must have it smelled like? The dynamic behind it all, some of these famous paintings. This one's of Daniel in the lion's den. It's by Peter Paul Rubens. It's in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. The only problem with this one is that Daniel was 80 years old when this happened. I don't think this person looks 80 years old. A little bit too strong and buff for that. So here's one that might be maybe a little more appropriate. It's a painting by Britton Revere, an English painter. And what's striking about this is Daniel, he is looking up. He's not looking at the circumstances of the lions, but he's looking up toward God. But what's also noticeable is that all the lions are as well, looking up to the Lord. So the way that I want to approach this passage is from the standpoint of this particular question. Why was Daniel thrown into the lion's den in the first place? And as we will see, it's because of his faith that both engaged and refused to engage the world. So with that in mind, for the next few minutes, we're going to look at this chapter, Daniel in the lion's den, and consider three thoughts. The first one, like Daniel, God's people living in exile are called to both engage and not engage the world. Number two, what will happen when you both engage and not engage? And three, the hope and strength God provides to both engage and not engage. So let's look at the first one. Like Daniel, God's people living in exile are called to both engage and not engage the world. Let's look at first engaging. From Daniel 6, verses 1 through 5, it says this: It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps. Darius now is the new king. Have you been following along with us? King Nebuchadnezzar passed away in the beginning. There was Belshazzar. The kingdom of Babylon's gone. The Medo-Persians are now ruling over, and Darius is the king in power. He set over 120 satraps, these representative leaders, dividing the kingdom into smaller districts to be throughout the whole kingdom. And over them, 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." And so we see here, as we're told in this passage, that Daniel is engaging Babylon. And a couple of things in terms of what it looks like. First of all, as exiles, God's people are to promote the good of society and the world. So in verse 2, it says, "And over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom the satrap should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss." Apparently there was corruption and things struggle going on in institutional organizations and government back then. It's even true now because sin is everywhere. But what I want you to see is that Daniel is in the secular public sphere as promoting the good of Babylon, so that the king might not suffer no loss. Here's a great temptation for all of us. And the temptation is to seek public space for the good of our name or for our people, our tribe. That's the temptation. Some of you are thinking that through, saying, if I make this career move, if I make this pivot or this jump, and you're wrestling through, and we ought to be deeply wrestling with the space that God has called you in, that you and I in. Is it for promoting the good of society and the world? Some of you are frustrated with God. Some of you are upset because you're thinking about your work. You feel like you're moving ahead, but nothing's happening. You're not being noticed. And could it be that what's driving it is not it's for the promotion, the good of your name, and not the good of society and the world? And maybe for some of you, let me just put it out here. You're wrestling through this as you think about the current space that you're in, and you're wondering, maybe it's something that I need to think about and maybe consider doing something different about it. So we see here that God's people are to promote the good of society and the world, but the second thing to note here is that God's people are to engage as salt. So Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says, "You are the salt of the earth." And truly, the book of Daniel, you see this being lived out in the story of Daniel in Babylon. Salt. One of the dangers for Christians today is we look at our Babylon and our world and go, "Oh my gosh, it's so messed up. It's so bad. We just need to just move out to hunker out and stay removed." But this is saying you're called to engage as salt. And salt has no purpose if it's in the salt shaker. It has no functional purpose. It's not doing anything if it's in the salt shaker. And in the ancient Near East, and even we know this now, you don't just put salt on any and every kind of food. You don't put salt on fruit. But in the ancient Near East, when and why did they use salt? It was used as a preservative for the food that was spoiling and going bad. That's where salt was being used and needed and called for. And friends, as I was thinking about this, it deeply convicts me, and I think about our church, and if you are the people of God and salt, are we, one, being in the salt shaker with no purpose, not engaging? Two, are we being poured out in areas that are just nice and comfortable because we want to avoid the stuff that goes bad? That's really challenging. So to engage in a way, what are those pockets and spaces in our city and our world where we go, it is messy, it is spoiling, it is hard. And what does it mean as God's people to be salt, to say, that's the space we're going to move towards and think through, not run away from? One more thought. God's people are to engage with biblical integrity. Verses 3-5, "Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him," the spirit of integrity. "And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom." Hey, you're going to be my number 2. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." How we are to engage as God's people is with biblical integrity because of our biblical conviction. He is faithful. And when people were conspiring against him because they were jealous to bring him down, they looked at his life and said, "There's nothing here. And the only way that we can go after Daniel is if we go after his faith." Here's a question I want to ask you. In your workplace, or if you're a student, among your friends and students and peers, among your colleagues, if you're a follower of Jesus, would they think the same about you? If they look at your life and say, oh, this person is not going to budge. There's a biblical conviction. It's not going to be wishy-washy or, oh, you know what, I might compromise here, your life, your character, your ethics, your decision choices, but they know about you. This person, because they follow Jesus, is set and determined and will not budge. Not only that, the only way that they can go after you is because of your faith. Because when it comes to your biblical conviction, you are firm and settled in the matter. Would they say that about you? So that's what we see here in terms of engaging. And I want you to see that this is Daniel chapter 6. And Daniel chapter 1, this is what Daniel's been doing all along. Daniel was a teenager in chapter 1. Now he's 80 years old. Young to old. Whether you're a student, you're an empty nester, God calls you to engage for the good of society and the world as salt with biblical integrity. So that's the first part. But that being said, there's also an aspect to not engage. So in chapter 6, verses 6 to 9, 10 to 11, then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. They're conspiring against him to trap Daniel. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. So essentially, these people are conspiring against Daniel, and they're trying to go to the king and basically saying, hey, King Darius, you're the new king. You know what we should do? Let's have a Darius Appreciation Month. For 30 days, let's have everyone go through a Darius Appreciation Month. What that means is it can only go through you. They can't make any other petitions to any of the other gods or any other people. It's only going to go through you. Darius Appreciation Month. And now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. According to the Medes and the Persians, once the king signed something, bound, even the king couldn't get out of it. And that phrase will come out several times in our chapter. So therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. Commentaries think the reason why is, hey, he's a new king, kind of consolidate power. So you have 120 different districts. Oh yeah, let's unify it all together. Darius Appreciation Month. Sounds like a good idea. Not only that, stroking his ego. So what happens next? When Daniel knew that this document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. So when Daniel hears about this, he refuses to engage. And so what we see here in this chapter, that God's people must not engage when it comes to assimilation or compromise. Some of you know that Daniel chapter 3 and chapter 6 are the 2 most well-known stories about persecution and not willing to compromise your faith. They're similar but different. Chapter 3 is about the challenge to Daniel's friends is you have to worship these idols. And they say, no, we will not. Here in chapter 6, it's, you can't worship your God. And Daniel says, oh, yes, I will. And so there's this refusal then to engage if it means that he cannot worship the Lord. In Acts chapter 5, verse 21, Peter is preaching and all the apostles, there's this renewal after Pentecost. People are coming to know Jesus. And so they're told, you must stop doing that. And Peter, it says here, but Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. Friends, as followers of Jesus, there's a place where you engage, like Daniel is doing in the public space for the good of society. But you do not engage when it comes to assimilation and compromise. So here's a second thought. Instead, there must be a beautiful resistance. There must be the joy of conviction in a culture of compromise. This is taken from John Tyson, title of his book. And I love that phrase. A beautiful resistance. Daniel here is not engaging. It's not an angry resistance. He's not saying, well, how dare they do that? Let's fight back fire with fire. It's a beautiful resistance as we see how he's going to respond. And what it calls for is this joy of biblical conviction, the joy of conviction in a culture of compromise. So let's see what he does. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he knows what's going on. The Darius Appreciation Month is being called out everywhere. He went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. Daniel's not showing off here, but he continues to do what he's doing with the windows open because he's saying, I'm not going to hide. I'm not going to hide. This is what he's been doing. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God. There's an incredible biblical theology of knees in the Bible. In Philippians 2, it says that all one day, all people will profess and all knees shall bow before the feet of Jesus. And that posture of acknowledging you as the King. It says he prayed and gave thanks 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, night. This wasn't just because things are looking really bad circumstances-wise, I'm going to do this, but this is what he's always been doing. Gave thanks before God as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God, a beautiful resistance. John Piper calls this prayer, he says, it is a defiant, it is daring, and it is a disciplined prayer, a beautiful resistance. Listen to this quote from John Tyson. Should we just give up and capitulate to the powers of our time? Should we sit by while our faith is taken captive by political and ideological forces, left, right, center? Should we avert our eyes while mammon wreaks havoc on our hearts? Should we watch 20 million young people leave the church in our generation? He cites a study for that number. Is it possible to build community in such a way that though it is small, generations to come will look back on our faithfulness in a generation of compromise? And friends, that is the call as we think about living in Babylon today. As God's people, if I could speak to you, that as we look at the book of Daniel, you are called to engage in such a way to bring the good and the shalom of the city, but you are called not to engage when it comes to assimilation and compromise. And so what it calls for is this deeper rooting of the joy of conviction in a culture of compromise where may the Spirit of God sweep through the people in our church, and we will say, we will have the joy of conviction in a culture of compromise, not on my watch. We will not give in. We will stand firm. And the ways that we begin to do so is through this beautiful resistance. So that's the first point. Like Daniel, God's people living in exile are called to both engage and not engage the world. Well, number 2, what will happen when you both engage and not engage the world? A couple of thoughts here. Number 1, there's going to be unavoidable conflict. When Daniel engages the world, there's conflict. When Daniel refuses to engage the world, not willing to assimilate or compromise, there's conflict, and it's unavoidable. And the passage even draws this out. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing stands fast, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is the one of the exiles from Judah, kind of a dig there, the exiles, remember, we conquered them, and we conquered the people who conquered them, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel, and he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. And sometimes it's just going to be unavoidable. You can tell that the king liked Daniel. He was favoring Daniel. He was for Daniel. The passage really points out that this king is the most powerful ruler in all the land, and he can't even avoid the conflict that's going to come. He tries to, he works hard for it, and it still comes. And listen, friends, conflict in that sense. You may have friends, people, higher ups, allies that can help have tons of influence in your world, in your orbit, and in this world. But no matter what, we will see the reality of living your faith, that there'll be at times be unavoidable conflict. So what do we learn from this? One, Christians should not be surprised. Over the past couple of years, I've heard people say, oh man, look at the past 5 years, or past 5-10 years. Things are so awful, so bad. I cannot, and they're like, oh my gosh, can you believe this happened? Yeah, you should. From what Scripture is saying, because the city of God and the city of man are always going to pull and be at odds with one another. Christians should not be surprised. So John 15:19, Jesus says, if you were of the world here is speaking of the city of man. That's there by the city of man, it says, the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. So on the one hand, we shouldn't be surprised saying, oh my gosh, what, can you believe this is happening? Well, you look at history, you look at the route, look what Jesus says. Yeah, you shouldn't be surprised. But number two, Christians should not be in despair. One of the unique things here about this passage is that you see the juxtaposition between Daniel and this king. This king is freaking out. This king is just circumstanced, just so distraught and anxious, loses sleep, cannot do anything about it. And Daniel, one of the commentaries say it's unique. Daniel only speaks 2 verses in this entire chapter. But of silence, it is telling. He's not freaking out. He's just, what we see here is that he's not in despair. He's not cynical. He's not hopeless. He's not fearful. What is going on? Daniel Akin, in his commentary on Daniel, wrote this one line: Christian character is not forged in the moment of adversity. Christian character is revealed in the moment of adversity. Because of the ways in which Daniel, he doesn't just say, oh no, this looks bad, I guess I really ought to be praying now. God does use that to bring awakening in our hearts. But you see this consistency regardless of the circumstances, regardless of what's happening. He's so much deeply entrenched. He's living and reflecting Psalm 1 in his life. Like a tree that's planted by the river, streams, firm, bearing fruit in and out of season. You see it so that when hardship comes, it's not, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to him? Will he rise to the occasion or not? No, it's what's true and what's been. It's revealed in the moment of adversity. How about you? What would it look like for you? So that's the one thing to note. There'll be unavoidable conflict, but two, what will happen when you engage and not engage the world? Your life will repel some people and be attractive to others. One of the things about Daniel as he's living in exile is that when you live in exile, live out the gospel in this way, engage the world but not engage the world, you become inexplicable. You see in Daniel, there are some people who are repelled by him, want to go against him, and then you see King Darius, who loves him and loves his God. And so you see this unique dynamic where there's something about the Christian faith that's going to repel to say, hey, you know what? We're so broken. We're so sinful. None of us can save ourselves. None of us are good. You need Jesus. Otherwise, there's no hope. People are like, how dare you? That's just awful. What? That sounds so prideful. How arrogant. There's something about repelling about that, and yet there's something so attractive that King Darius goes, there's something about your faith and it's impacting your ethics, impacting the way you think about it, the way you're living it out not for yourself. So it repels and attracts. Here's the thing. Today, there are too many people who say they're Christians, and there's no repelling whatsoever, and there's nothing attractive as they live in exile. There's no repelling whatsoever because they're so compromised. I mean, they're so fearful. They're not, hey, I don't want to rock the boat. I'm just going to kind of be, positive and not say anything, and you're not living it out. And it's not attractive because instead of conviction over compromise, it's compromise over conviction. It looks nothing different. And so here's the thing. To engage and not engage, do not mix the two. Do not mix the two where some of you saying, I'm a follower of Jesus. You ought to be engaging in the way for the good of society, but you are not engaging out of fear and out of a desire that everything's messed up. Do not mix that up with, don't engage when it comes to assimilation and culture, but you are. And that's the challenge set before us. And when you begin to live out the gospel in exile, you become inexplicable. Both sides of it begin to become reality. Let's look at the third. Daniel in the lion's den. We looked at number one, like Daniel, God's people living in exile are called to both engage and not engage the world. Number two, what will happen when you both engage and not engage the world? And three, the hope and strength God provides to both engage and not engage the world. There's so many dynamics with this. Fear that we don't want to engage, self-righteousness and anger that we are going to engage and blast people. The hope and strength God provides to engage and not engage the world as followers of Jesus living in exile. The living God whom we serve is the ultimate deliverer. That phrase, living God whom we serve, is a deliverer. Our passage highlights this several times to us. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve, continually deliver you. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. Hold on. The king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. Apparently, when he fasted, the lions decided to fast too. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at the break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel said to the king, these are the only two verses that Daniel speaks in this narrative. "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. Some commentary suggests what's happening here to help perhaps an idea to understand was in the ancient Near East. There was a difference when you were charged. There was a difference between a trial by execution and a trial by ordeal. A trial by execution meant that you are guilty and the result is execution. And if it was that, if he was thrown into the lion's den and he's saved for one day, then the next day you're still in the den until you're killed. But another way is by a trial by ordeal when you're charged, but you're not quite sure whether you're guilty or not. And one of the practices of the ancient Near East was this trial by ordeal. If you were thrown into the river and if you drowned, you were guilty. If you're thrown into the river and you survived, you were declared innocent and you were set free. And I wonder if that's one of the lenses that Darius is coming through in what's happening here. And even with Daniel, the way that he even responds. He says, hey, I've done no harm. He's not saying he's without any sin, but he's saying, hey, this trial that's happening, it's not. And Daniel is obviously, his perspective is because it's rooted in his faith in the Lord. Just a thought there to consider. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. That is brutal. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Some commentaries, suggest ideas, hey, Daniel was okay because, they were old lions, they weren't hungry, or they were fed beforehand. No, this reflects it was a supernatural protection that God made the lions do some intermittent fasting when Daniel was down there. And so what we see here is that the living God whom we serve is the ultimate deliverer. As Daniel's engaging and not engaging in the results of what's happening with conflict that's unavoidable, the living God is alive and he's at work in exile. Whom we serve. God does not exist to serve us, but we serve God. He doesn't exist to serve and prop up our idols of comfort and his success and accolade and whatever that might look like, but we are to serve God. And ultimate deliverer, God delivers Daniel from the lion's den. That's the hope and strength that God provides. Now, I'm going to ask you this question. This story of Daniel is so well known. I'm just curious. How many of you grew up learning about the story of Daniel in the lion's den? Raise your hand. There's a lot of you. I did too. So it is a famous, well-known story. But here's the thing. The story of Daniel in the lion's den is so well known, and yet it has often been taught in a way that has not only been unhelpful, but hurtful. And what do I mean by that? It's so well known, and yet it has often been taught in a moralistic way. The moralistic way that says, if you are faithful and blameless, God will always deliver you out of your lion's den. And that has been unhelpful and even hurtful. Some of you, you're struggling in your faith because that's what you believe, a moralistic version of it. So you're thinking, I need to have more faith. I need to be more blameless. God's not delivering me from this, so I need to amp it up and become more faithful and be more like that. And it's always causing you a deep sense of anxiety and angst. That's moralism. Or it could have been hurtful. Some of you are maybe here, you're ready to say, dude, this Christianity stuff, I've chucked out. Or you have friends who say, I no longer believe in God. Why? Because they believed in a moralistic version of the book of Daniel in the lion's den. Because they were thinking, I was faithful and God didn't deliver me from the lion's den. I knew people who loved God and God didn't deliver them. So this danger of this moralistic lens is not helpful, it's often hurtful, and that is not what this chapter is teaching, and that is not what Christianity is teaching. How do we know that? Because there is someone far more faithful than Daniel. There's someone far more blameless than Daniel, and his name is Jesus. And Jesus was not rescued as he was thrown into the lion's death as he hung on the cross. So if that's not the moralistic framework, how do we understand this passage and what it drives us to? It speaks of the living God whom we serve is the ultimate deliverer, and to understand that from our lens today, forward and back. Forward, it speaks of a day that one day God's going to return and there's going to be the ultimate deliverance at hand. In Isaiah chapter 11 and Isaiah chapter 65, it says something amazing. Isaiah says, in that day, the wolf will lie down with the lamb, and the lion will lie down and be with the fattened calf, and the lion will eat straw like an ox. What is he saying? He's saying that one day, all the imagery of lions and violence and evil, there's going to be peace, because one day the Prince of Peace is going to bring comprehensive peace in our world. The Prince of Peace will bring that about. It's future. But not only is it future in which we can have hope, that future we can know to be certain because of the past. Because as we look at the cross, we see that Jesus is the true and better Daniel. Just as Daniel was wrongfully accused by people, Jesus was wrongfully accused. Just as Daniel was thrown into the pit to die, and the morning he rose again, Jesus, the greater Daniel, was thrown into the pit, and one morning he rose again from the dead. Just as Daniel was thrown in with this sealed stone that couldn't be broken, so Jesus was thrown into the pit with a sealed stone. The difference is that Daniel, in our passage, was thrown into the pit. He didn't die, and he came out alive the next morning. But Jesus, the true and greater Daniel, was thrown into the pit, and he died. And glory be, on that morning, he rose again. The living God whom we serve is the great deliverer. So what we learn and see is that Jesus is the true and greater Daniel who went into the ultimate lion's den for us. He's a living God. He is the resurrected God whom we serve. There is no other king whom we serve where is like this king, where Jesus says the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And he's the ultimate deliverer who delivers us from sin and death. And so what we then learn is that when we see Jesus going into the ultimate lion's den for our sake, we will be able to confront the various lion's den in our lives. Tim Keller puts it this way and says, if you know this to be true, he personalized it and said, I can deal with diseases in my life if I know that God addressed the ultimate disease of sin and death in that ultimate lion's death of what Jesus did for me. I can deal with financial stress, hardship, and being in debt. This lion's death of financial stress, hardship, and being in debt. Because I know that in the ultimate lion's den, all my debts have been paid off. And I am accepted in Jesus Christ. I can deal with loneliness. Whether I'm single or married, I could deal with my deep sense of loneliness, the lion's den of loneliness, ultimately if I know that on that day in Jesus, he experienced loneliness on the greatest level so that you and I can be accepted and brought into ultimate community. That's the strength and the hope that God provides us through the story of Daniel and the lion's den. The last section, then King Darius wrote to all the people, nations, languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is a living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. Daniel, all of the chapters of chapter 5, it closes with the king, the most powerful person saying, I'm not the most powerful. Daniel, your God is the most powerful. And the whole story of the book of Daniel is that the Lord God reigns in exile. Therefore, be faithful in the Lord, for he is with you. And it reminds us of that truth. And then lastly, so this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian, that even in exile, you can thrive and you can grow because the living God, Jesus, the risen King, whom you serve, is the ultimate deliverer, and he's with you. Amen. Pray with me.